Excellent. So let's get started here a little bit. We'll get into the BRRRR method. Feel free to ask any questions you have, any specifics on this method, but I think it's one of the best ones we have. This is my personal favorite. It's what we specialize in predominantly. Basically, the way I think of BRRRR is flipping a house to yourself. The idea is buy a house as if you can flip it, but instead of using your equity to profit off of the equity, the built-in equity that you get from buying right, you use that as a down payment to purchase your next, or to be able to refinance the property, and preferably, if you do it right, have none of your own money into it. If you have a little, I mean, we'll get into this more. Generally speaking, you need to have some contingencies. Sometimes you're going to leave a little bit on the table, so you do need to have some money there to make sure in case something goes wrong. Oftentimes, Murphy's Law, things go wrong. That's just how it is. So let's get started. Let's start with the buy side. So the buy side, I say again, like you're buying thinking like a flipper. You're buying to flip this house, except for there are some differences. Some people think with regards to flipping and buy and hold, it's just the same. But flipping, you're generally looking for like middle class and above. You know, in the Kansas City market, which is kind of the price point I'm most used to. When I think of a flip, I want to be generally over $150,000. When I'm thinking of a hold, I generally want to be more closer to $100,000. Now I know that's going to be very different for different markets, but with regards to you're going to be using nicer materials. You're going to be using I put in a chandelier or something, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances. If you're flipping, if you're buying to hold, you're thinking of a renter. You want it to be nice, but you don't need it to be great. I do think some people think of BRRRR as just a way to buy without any money down, and I do think that's not the best way to do it. You want that's the goal, but you can't assume that's going to be the case. So I wouldn't go into a BRRRR strategy with absolutely no money. I see it as a very low money down strategy. That's the way to look at it. Well, Jared's got a question here. If we already have a mortgage out for a house, then you take out another mortgage for another house, and you do the BRRRR strategy, how can you be qualified for multiple loans off of only your available income? When they ask the question, do you have any extra income you would like to mention, does that help you take out multiple loans on multiple properties? One of the things with regards to getting multiple loans, like for us, we've gone down the way quite a bit. So we have we are able to get loans based on the income of our company. Now, early on, you might have some trouble with this because they're only looking at your W-2 income. They're not looking at your rental income. It's just a matter of building up a little bit of a history. Once you have a property and you have a history of that property making income for you, making money, you can add. They will take that into account as well. They might not take it into account right away, and this is kind of similar to a seasoning issue, which we'll get to more when we get down into refinancing. Banks want to see a history, and so it's one of those things. Real estate, I've said this a lot. It's a get rich slow scheme, and so you're not going to be able to buy everything right off the bat, and you might have to buy one and then hold that for a while, build a history, and then once the bank sees that yes, that income is coming in, they can comfortably count that with your W-2 income. That should be able to help you get the next loan and then the next one and the next one. You're building up. It's pyramiding up, and if at the beginning it's a little bit harder, and the banks are going to be a little bit more skeptical, but that's just a process of working your way up one step at a time. Let's see if there are any other questions. Who is selling a property? Well, I'm not selling a property in Brooklyn, New York, so I can't help you there, Fred. Fregi? I'm butchering names. By the way, when I butcher names, that's also Zach's fault, just FYI. But yeah, I think with regards, we'll focus a little bit on the buy side, and I'll look over and see whatever questions we have, and give you as best of answers as I can. But I would say one of the things that I see happen a lot to buy and hold investors on the buying side is the tendency to get a little bit lazy. The flipping gives you a very hard, this is especially if you have some money and you can cover expenses or a shortfall. If it doesn't appraise out and you have to put a little bit of, or leave a little bit of your own money in. But there's a tendency to get lazier when you're holding. It's a lot easier to rationalize not getting a sufficient amount of equity in a deal, because it's like, well, it cash flows fine, or I still have some equity or anything like that. I see a tendency to reach more when it comes to buy and hold investors. And that is that is something to really watch out for, because there's always the ability to rationalize away an appraisal. And sometimes appraisals are bad, but sometimes they're bad in your favor. But there's always the ability to rationalize away an appraisal. Like, this appraisal is garbage. Like, they didn't take this. They took this comp and this comp. They should have taken these other ones. It's a lot easier to do that and kind of justify in your mind of getting a lesser quality deal, because you don't have that feedback mechanism that flippers have, which is simply their profit and loss. If you lose money on a deal, that's a real kick in the pants. That's gonna teach you that you got to look a little bit more carefully next time. Buy and hold investors don't. Now, when you're looking at the BRRRR strategy, you have a little bit more of that, but it's still easier to justify and rationalize in your own mind. Well, the appraisal came back bad and the appraisal was wrong and whatnot. It's a tendency you've got to fight against as a buy and hold investor with regards to getting a little bit lazy and settling for deals that you wouldn't have if you were thinking of flipping. And that's the way I really tell people when they're looking at BRRRR deals. Think of it as a flipper, but you're flipping the property yourself. You're flipping the financing. Let's go look through the questions here. Tips for the Indiana market. Unfortunately, I am in Kansas City. I think Indiana is a pretty similar market, but I mean, I would say that it's a good market. It's a good market for buy and hold. Markets that I find the best for buy and hold are generally in the Midwest, in the South, maybe in sort of those tertiary markets that are a little bit less expensive. Ones where it's easier for the property to cash flow, because one of the big keys I would say with unless you have an extremely good reason to believe that a property is going to appreciate, say, like there's a massive development coming in nearby or something along those lines, you should never be buying a property that's not going to cash flow. And the way we think of it, because we get a loan up front before the buy side. We could even call it the BRRRR strategy, or the FBRRR, maybe put an F in front of it, because we get a private loan, generally speaking, not always, but we generally get a private loan on these properties in front. And we usually go about 8 to 9% interest only. And our goal, our criteria, is that it has to cash flow even with a fully financed with an 8 to 9% interest only loan. And that fully financed is the cost of purchasing it and the cost of rehabbing it, and also taking into account loan fees. That's another thing that can get missed a lot in the BRRRR strategy. You are going to have you obviously have some closing costs up front. They usually won't be very much, but you will have some loan fees. A lot of banks charge 1%, 1 point, plus you've got 19 different little fees they'll throw in there, the nickel and dime you here and there. And if you're not counting those two, that is going to force you to leave more money into the property. It's a hidden cost that a lot of people don't think about. A lot of people don't think about holding costs when it comes to flipping, or they don't think enough about them, or they assume that their original budget will be sufficient when oftentimes it's not. And so these are the hidden costs that you need to look into whenever buying for any reason, but especially when doing it for buy and hold. How do you come up with your this is from Corel. Again, I butcher names. My apologies. Zach's apologies. How do you come up with the buying criteria for your flips and your holds? Again, I separate them into two categories generally. I mean, it's the same. You want to get that same margin. We generally aim for at least 75%. There's the famous 70% rule for flips. So you want to get that equity regardless. With flips, again, you're usually looking at a higher price point. That because just if you're all into a property for $140,000 and you flip for $200,000, minus your closing costs, you're going to make $45,000 or thereabout. Now, if you just drop that in half, all of a sudden, now you're all into a property for $70,000 and you're selling it for $100,000. Now you're only going to make around $20,000. The margin is same deal, often the same amount of work. The margin, the actual amount of profit is substantially less. In addition, a roof costs the same on a $100,000 house as it does on a $200,000 house. A lot of things cost the same or similar. I mean, maybe you're putting in nicer appliances, but they're not twice as expensive generally speaking. And so you have less room for error. But generally, also the rents don't go up as fast as the cost of a house, and so those properties won't rent for twice the amount of a $100,000 house. So when we're looking at flips, we're generally wanting it more expensive, and in nicer areas. We want places people want to live. They for a long time. So it's less of we want a decent enough school district. We really want a good school district. We don't want an area that's not a war zone or solid. We want an area with really low crime. That's our preference for flipping. With holding, the idea is we want to stay out of war zones. I mean, there are some people who specialize in niches that, in rough areas, and you can make money there. There are good people there, good tenants. But I highly recommend avoiding those areas for anyone who's just getting started, and also for anyone who's not going to specialize in that niche. I think you really need to specialize in that if you are going to go that route. So I would say out of really bad areas, really dilapidated areas, areas with high vacancy, with the boarded up houses or burnt out house that hasn't been touched, where you don't see the pride of ownership or even the pride of rentership. I guess people are just like, keeping their lawns clean, keep mowed and whatnot, keep the trash in the streets, things like that. So we want to be in areas that are at least like that. We want to be in areas that at least have decent school districts. I mean, you might not be in a great school district, but we don't want to be one like for example, I'm in Kansas City, and Kansas City school district was lost its accreditation this is almost a decade ago. Got it back. But that's not the school district we are looking for. I mean, there might be areas in there that, a lot of people send their kids to private school or something like that that makes sense. We're not looking for those type of areas. We're not looking for high crime areas. We want areas, we expect maybe it's going to be, 1.3, 1.5 times the national average, but we don't want something 2.5 times the national average or something like that. So we want to be in areas that are relatively easy to manage. There's a very good graph, I think it's in the Millionaire Real Estate Investor, and he has all these different things like the hassle in managing a property, how much cash flow you'll get, and it starts with the worst properties to the best properties, and you get this very high, a lot of hassle with really low properties, but also a lot of hassle with really expensive properties because you have a group of people that expects everything to be perfect. They're paying a lot in rent, and the cash flow is not going to be very good. He recommends for buy and hold properties to be in the lower middle part of the market, and I fully agree with him. I'd say working class to middle class, C to B minus. That is the area I recommend, and we look for areas like that we think have, preferably with some growth potential, in Kansas City, or it can be whatever market you're in, that makes sense given that have solid fundamentals, but maybe not great fundamentals. Very little vacancy and solid schools and not a ton of crime and not a lot of dilapidated properties or anything like that, but also not an upper end area, just like a lot of houses built in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Those types of areas are our favorite for buy and hold, because if you get too expensive, it's hard to get them to cash flow. If you get too low, they're too much of a hassle. There's too much risk. And generally speaking, the capital expenses, repairing the roof, repairing the HVAC, repairing when you have a bad tenant, those things will eat up all of your cash flow. So even if you have a house for, Ben Leibovich goes over this all the time. If you have a house for $30,000, your capital expenses and keeping in turnovers and all the rest of those things, they're going to eat up all your cash flow. You have a cheap house, but you're not going to make any money. So so then we start looking for areas like that in Kansas City that makes sense. We drive those areas. We talk to people. We talk to see where we're looking for properties of a price point of generally between $50,000 to $150,000. Now in certain markets that's not going to work, but that's Kansas City, and a lot of markets like Indianapolis and St. Louis and whatnot are going to be similar to that. And so that's how we generally pick our areas. Those areas that fit into that criteria are the best, and then we start going off of our own experience. If we start having trouble in particular areas, then we are going to lean against that more so. If areas start working really well for us, we might look more into that. Or if our jobs start coming into those areas, we might go more into that. So it's really to look at what you're looking for, is to set your criteria, and that's generally our criteria: C to B minus. Generally speaking, doesn't have to be 50s to 70s built houses, decent areas. Low vacancy, at least stable population, not too much crime, $50,000 to $150,000, of course, depending on your market, and then find the areas that fit that. And you can find some of this data pretty simply for free. You can go to citydata.com, clrsearch.com. Those will have the data by zip code. City Data even has data broken down by subdivision, and you can get more expensive ones too, but those should do just fine for you up front. Let's see if we got any other questions here. Spend some time on that. I would like to get a HELOC on my current home to start the BRRRR strategy. Do I have to go to the same mortgage lender I currently have? No. I think that would be the first place to start. If they're willing to give you a HELOC, I mean they have a history with you. They have seen you continuing to pay on your current mortgage. That we've always had the best luck with regards to banks, with banks that we already have a relationship with. If we have a relationship with, they start to trust us more and more and more and more. And so that's always the first place to start, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that. What U.S. markets do you recommend to apply the BRRRR method? This is from Jay Garcia. Here in SoCal, prices are inflated, and it would be hard to get a cash flowing property. I can definitely agree with that. I know in Los Angeles, or pretty much anywhere in California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, the prices of a studio apartment could cost over $1 million in many places, or a studio condo. I recommend the best areas, generally speaking, are the Midwest and the South. So we're talking like places like Kansas City or Indianapolis or Oklahoma City or Tulsa or Des Moines, or often to like Memphis and St. Louis and down into the South, Raleigh and Atlanta's gotten pretty expensive. But areas like that is the best area, but it's not the only area. There might be my father's still in Eugene, Oregon. That's where he originally started the company, and he's still able to find properties in Eugene, even some in Portland. And Portland has gotten very expensive. It's not easy. There are many fewer, but there are some there that can work. Generally, in the sort of less desirable areas, or maybe if you go into multifamily. Let's take a quick digression into buying out of state. I think David Green just came out with a book on buying out of state. I'd recommend checking it out. I also have an article titled, I think, like the three important things to vet before you buy out of state. I highly recommend that. I've seen a lot of people lose their shirt buying out of state. There are some great turnkey operators. There are some relatively shady ones. There's also there's a tendency for out of state investors to, especially if they're coming from Los Angeles or New York or Miami, or I've seen people from Sydney, Australia coming to, or China even coming into Kansas City looking at properties. And you come from a market where a condo costs $1.5 million, and then all of a sudden you're seeing this 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, this old Victorian, that's 2,500 square feet, selling for $40,000, $50,000. And there's this temptation, and even we had it when we moved out from Eugene to Kansas City a bit. We knew this was the case, but we still had this temptation of seeing like, well, it's cheap, so it's good. It's a good deal, but that's not the case. Every market is local, and as we just talked about a little bit earlier, those really cheap properties, often there's no way to make them cash flow if they're in a bad neighborhood and you don't specialize in that type of product. But I do think, particularly for people who are living in very expensive markets, out-of-state investing can work. You just need to be very careful about who you get, who do you work with. Who would if you go with a turnkey company, vet them very carefully, interview them, talk to clients they've used, maybe ask on the BiggerPocket forums about them. Look at their ratings online. If you're going to use a property manager, interview them. I would say, and also when you use one, don't be afraid to switch. I mean, there are some property management is a tough business, and some people I don't think a lot. I think there's some mouths, but most of it's just not being able to get the job done, and that happens. And so sometimes you don't be afraid to switch if you're not getting that cash flow. I would say for any out-of-state investors, don't buy ever unless you visit. Google Earth makes things look nicer than they are often, because you don't have the you don't see it in movement. You don't smell it sometimes even. And so being there, and especially checking out at night, that can help too. It gives you a good feel for the neighborhood, and you can ask the locals, ask around, ask people that are actually living nearby or at the property or walking through. What do you think of this neighborhood? As well as checking everything online. So be very, very careful buying out of state, but it can work. That being said, even more expensive markets, Los Angeles is probably an exception, but even more expensive markets do generally have pockets that can still work for buy and hold. And so it's not necessarily the only way to buying out of state if you're in a very expensive market. It might be a little bit harder to use the burst. It might be a little bit harder to get them to cash flow well, but there's also more appreciation potential, generally speaking. So there are advantages to buying it in more expensive markets. But if you do decide to take the leap and going out of state, you need to vet it very carefully. You need to visit. You need to not be afraid to get rid of your management company or get rid of your contractor. And you need to be pretty active in the management process. And that's true for anyone who's using third-party management, but particularly if you're investing out of state. Let's look through the comments here. Aman, so how do you estimate what the value will appraise for after rehab? I look at comparable sales, but sometimes comparable sales are only for homes that have different square footages for the same bedroom and bathrooms. Okay, that's a very good question. When you're going through the the comping process, the first point is you were trying to just do the absolute basics. You are trying to make each comparable as similar, find comparables that is similar to your property as possible, as similar to your property when your property is done. You're not looking at what it's valued now. You're looking at what it will be valued after you're done with the rehab. So when I'm going through comps, and the best access to this is the MLS, which you need to have a real estate license to do, or you can ask a realtor to put together a CMA for you. And you can also use Zillow and Trulia and Redfin. Those will work as well. They're not as good. They don't have as good of the ability to find all of the different comparables and as well. But they can still work if you don't have access to the MLS. But look for properties that are as close as possible, that have similar square footage, that were built in similar, within 10 years preferably, that have similar beds and baths, and that are not. You don't want to compare you don't want to compare it to a foreclosure because those generally sell for less. Preferably don't want to compare it to an estate sale either. Those also sell for a little bit less. If possible, you want to compare it to homeowners and not investor sales. Some investor sale you can compare them to that, but I prefer to go look at what's because some investors sell them but not quite done kind of thing. They're just looking to flip them really quick, and of course, if at all possible, you want to comp it to something in the same neighborhood or the same subdivision. It might not be in the same style. You don't want to, if you can avoid it, you don't want to compare a ranch to a split or something like that. But you might have to. That being said, some comps are really, really easy. It's just cookie cutter. They're the exact, it's like this house is the exact, built by the same subdivision, same bed, same bath, same square footage, same year built by the same developer. And you can just be like, well, it sold 2 months ago, and it sold for $143,000. So yeah, that's pretty much perfect. That's not always the case, particularly if you're getting into rural properties or odd properties or even multifamily, like duplexes and fourplexes are harder to comp too, and they're also a little small to use cap rates for. So at that point, you need to know that you need to have more wiggle room in your price, and what I mean by that is you can't be as confident in whatever number you come to. There's got to be more give there, and probably you got to be like, okay, this is what I think it's worth, but I need to have I need to assume that it might not sell for quite that, and there's still got to be a margin there, or it might not quite, appraise for that when I'm trying to refinance it. Then what you want to do is you want to think like an appraiser. An appraiser goes through and says, okay, this house has central air and this one doesn't, so I'm going to make a $3,500 adjustment to the price. So if you have a property that you've got a 3-bedroom, let's say you have a 4-bedroom, 3-bath, and the only thing you can compare it to is 3-bed and 2-bath. Well, you've got to make as educated an assumption of what is that extra bedroom and bathroom worth. Generally, extra bedrooms, unless it's from 2 to 3, are not worth that much. Extra bathrooms are worth quite a bit. Same goes for square footage. And so you want to, and also you got to be careful with that because, like for example, in Kansas City and I believe many other places, split level houses only count square footage that is above so a split level house, you walk in and there's stairways, right? And you can either go up or down. And you go down and usually there's a bedroom and a bathroom and maybe a living room or something, and then also you can go over into the garage, and then there's a utility room and a basement area behind that. And this is often counted, even though it's finished space, it's often counted as finished basement, not part of the square footage, because it's partially underground. And often with these splits, it's like 2/3 of it is above ground. There are windows right there. It feels above ground. It really is square footage. And so you have like these 900 square foot 4-bed, 2.5 bath splits. That I've seen stuff like that, which is just something you've got to be cognizant of. You got to make sure you got to go through the smell test. Does this smell right? No, it doesn't. Okay. But you want to try to look at, and it's not going to be perfect. Comping a property is not a science. It's a little bit so, but it's sort of a combination art and science. And you want to make as careful of adjustments to the other properties you can, the closest you can find, to figure out about approximately what that house is going to be worth. And so, I'd say the 2 lessons are: 1, think of it as trying to make those other houses identical to yours. And that is true for how long ago it sold. If it sold a year ago, and the market has appreciated 5% or whatever, that means that sale price is probably a little bit lower than what it would be if you listed it. Although an appraiser is not generally going to take that into account. So, but if you're flipping it, absolutely. So that's the first thing. You're trying to take the comps and turn them into your house with whatever adjustments are necessary, and hopefully they're very few. And the second one is the worse comps you have, the less confidence you can have in your ARV. And so those are the two major points that I'd make with regards to figuring out what your ARV is if you don't have those really cookie cutter comps next door. Let's see. We got some more questions here. This is from Brad Miller. For first-time BRRRR, would you recommend a property management company or DIY? I would say, with regards to, I think, with regards to any, I mean, this is just a buy and hold strategy. It could be BRRRR or it could be anything. Personally, we always manage our own properties. We call it in-house management versus out-house management. That being said, I don't think there's a perfect answer for this. I wrote an article a while back on whether you should manage yourself or manage or hire a property management company. So I'll just go down quickly kind of the advantage. The biggest advantage for hiring a property management company is one, it's less hassle. You don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to do all those things yourself. You don't have to take calls about a toilet leaking late at night. You don't have to worry about, you don't have to worry about getting all the forms and all the documents and the property management software. I mean, they've got all those things lined up, and they've also got experience in this area, whereas you might not. That being said, they generally going to cost probably 10% of the rent plus either half or all of the first month's rent. They are also there are some that are not very good. It's like. I guess the biggest thing I would say is there's no one that's going to care more about your property than yourself. And I do think there's an advantage to seeing and experiencing the property management side of the business yourself, seeing what goes through, what's going on, and kind of learning that side of the business. Even if you eventually turn it over to a property management company. That being said, if you're planning on only owning like one or two properties, I'm not sure. I mean, it's one of those questions. You have to just look at the advantages and disadvantages. My personal and just go with what makes most sense for you. My personal preference would probably be to manage myself, especially. But that being said, we have a fairly large operation here. I mean, it's kind of a full-time gig. If you're doing for a part-time thing, I think you really need to see that as really need to weigh the pros and cons. And also remember, it doesn't. Once you pick a route, that does commit you to that forever. If a property management company's not getting the job done, as I said before, just get rid of them. Politely, but just let them go. And if you are struggling with the property management side of it or whatnot, then you can always turn it over to a property management company. But I'd say just weigh the pros and cons, and if you are going to go with a property management company, make sure to ask for referrals. I would recommend going to asking on BiggerPockets, or going to your local RIA and asking for investors who do it. Who are the best property management companies? Same goes for banks. We can jump down the line a little bit and talk about refinancing. That is by far my favorite way with regards to finding lenders. Go to your local RIA and ask them who they're using. Because if you're asking for contractors, they might be like, well, I'm using this contractor all the time, I don't want to tell you. But if you're asking for banks, there's not that sort of limitation. I've never had somebody say, "Oh, I won't tell you which banks we're using." They'll give them to you very quickly. And if they're willing to lend to another investor doing exactly what you're doing, there's likelihood they'll finance you as well. And the same goes for BiggerPockets. I've given bank recommendations on BiggerPockets a lot. So just go to your local forum. Like, do you guys have who's lending to single-family investors or multifamily or kind of absentee owners or investors on these types of properties. And also on one side, we'll go on that just a little bit longer. One other note with regards to the financing angle. When you're asking them what they want or what they're willing to, asking a bank whether or not they'd be interested in this kind of thing, make sure to ask them about their seasoning requirements. This is something that gets missed a lot. Some banks are willing to, for the BRRRR strategy to work, you need to refinance the property at its appraised value, not your cost into it. The whole point is to pull out most of your costs. If it's done perfectly, you have no money into the property and you have basically a free property that's cash flowing for you with 25+% equity. We've even had ones where we pulled out money and it's still cash flowed, and so we've basically been rewarded for purchasing a property with free money, which is nice. That being said, some banks will only refinance at the total cost you have in the property, your purchase price plus your rehab costs, for a certain period of time. When we first came out to Kansas City, well, pretty much nobody would lend to us at all. It was right after the Great Recession. But once we started getting into it, once we finally started finding banks, they were talking 2-year seasoning requirements. We'll only loan to you on the cost, and that's useless for a BRRRR investor. We need to go off the appraised value. And at first it was 2-year seasoning. We had to wait 2 years. Then around 2015, 2016, banks started doing it immediately upon once you've rehabbed and rented out the property. Immediately, so there's no seasoning period. It just needs to be fixed and rented. Now we're starting to see seasoning periods come back, 6 months, a year. But make sure you know what you're getting into. It can take some time to do a BRRRR successfully, but as we've been over, real estate is the get rich slow strategy. So we got some more questions. Hi, Mike. Quentin Quark. Nice. Hi from London, Ontario. Nice. Welcome. So, Mike, can you explain financing a property that needs a rehab? I read that most banks won't finance a property that needs a rehab. Does that mean we would need hard money or private money, then refinance later? Well, let me first go over our strategy in general. We always get a private loan up front. And we try to get it for the cost of the property and also our estimated rehab. And generally speaking, I don't know anyone, I've never met a single person, real estate investor or otherwise, who has said, you know what, I'm always under budget. I always estimate more than it actually costs. That I have yet to run into, and I don't think I'm going to. It's always more than you think. It always costs more and takes longer. Just assume it. Murphy's Law applies to real estate investment as well. So I always put in holding costs, make sure not to miss those, some do. Make sure to include anticipated loan costs and closing costs, but also include a contingency. We put in we take whatever our estimated rehab is going to be and add 20% to it, because it's like maybe this AC works, but once you really put a load on it, it breaks. Or maybe you're going to open up this wall and realize there was rot that you didn't see. There's always stuff like that. So that way, kind of going on a tangent here, but that is make sure to add that all up front. So we look to get private lenders. I recommend that route, particularly if you don't have a large amount of money. Now, again, I do think you need to have some. If you don't have any, I'd probably get into. You don't have much or very, very little, I'd get into. I would flip first. Another good strategy for buy and hold I like is the flip and hold, where you flip a property, make some money to live off of, flip another one, that gets you a down payment for one that you can hold. Or maybe get into wholesaling or just work at your job a little bit longer, build up some more savings or something along those lines. But if you're going to if you don't have a huge amount of money, but you have some, private lending is the best way to go. I would not recommend a hard money lender. I generally would say hard money lenders are tough in general because they're very expensive. I mean, we're talking 12 to 15% interest rates, 3 to 5 points. I've seen worse. That's going to eat up much of your margin, if not all of your margin. I would try to avoid hard money lenders. I would work for either private money lenders or your own. Now, you can get a bank loan. I think that's what Mike was talking about. You can get a bank loan up front. There's a couple things to know about this. The first one is you're going to have to pay 2 sets of loan fees. You're going to have to pay the loan fees for financing the property, because no bank is going to lend to you at appraised value of a property when it's done up front. They're going to lend to you based on your cost. Now, so you will have to finance it up front, pay that point and closing costs and whatever they're going to charge you, and then pay it again when you refinance. So you got to be prepared for that. It's going to be better than a hard money lender for sure, but it will still be an extra expense, and it would be more expensive than if you get a private lender who's not going to charge you any points. The second thing to know, with regards to lending on refinance, there are banks that will lend on refinance. Generally, actually, most will. They might not be that enthusiastic about it if you haven't built any sort of relationship with them, but I mean, there are certainly banks that have been willing to lend to us with including the rehab, without us having done any loans with them in the past. The way they do it is they put the rehab money in escrow. So you get 75% of your purchase price, and you get 75% of your anticipated rehab, assuming they'll look at the scope, assuming they think your scope is reasonable. And then they will give you draws on it at certain points. It depends on the bank, depends on what you agree to. But once you do a certain amount of work, you send them the invoices, maybe send them pictures. I mean, every bank is different what they require, and prove that you've spent that money and done that work. Then they'll release those funds back to you. And so that is the general way to do it. So you can get and there are hard money lenders or that will lend. I've seen ones that say they'll lend on. I haven't used any of them, but I've seen ones that say they'll lend 100% of the rehab cost, like 75% of the purchase and 100% of the rehab. I haven't used any of those. I can't attest to them. But yeah, you can get the refinance or the rehab finance. It's a little bit trickier. There's more paperwork. You've got to kind of hold those expenses over until you can get those draws. So you will need a little bit more money up front. But if you can get private lenders, that is my favorite way to go about it. Unless, of course, you can just afford to buy it for cash, do the rehab, and then refinance it out at the back end. Okay. Let's look for some more questions here. From David, how can you guarantee seasoning before getting into a project? I think this is an important question, and I think the big key here is that I think a lot of people wait until they're ready to refinance to start looking for a bank. And I say start looking for a bank right now. I don't see any reason to wait, because you want to build that relationship as much as possible, even before you've taken out your first loan. It takes a while. I've had experiences with banks that are trying, to say the least, where you just go on, and they just keep dragging their feet, and then finally they say no. And so you want to start right now. There's no reason to stop. Explain your strategy, explain what you're doing, even before you purchase property. Is this something you'd be willing to do? You might be able to get a pre-approval letter or something like that. But I would start meeting with, call up your local banks, call the banks that you've got from your RIA group. One strategy we use I like to give because it's fairly unique is we'll go to like ListSource, and we'll look for properties, and we'll do a search for anyone who's made a loan, any bank, any institution that's made a loan on a property to an absentee owner, so non-owner occupant, or in the last year in our price range in the area we're looking to invest. And then we get those banks, and we know those banks are willing to lend to investors in the area and price point we're interested in, and I'll just call them up. We've gotten actually, I think 3 banks that way, and one of our absolute best banks that way. But the key is just get started right now. If you can't, I mean, they might not be interested in vetting you, getting you pre-approved or something like that, but they probably will. Every bank is looking for business if they're interested in this category. And take them out for lunch. I think in one way this kind of is a good segue into another point I think is important, and that is the importance of good accounting. You want to have really good numbers. If you have a rental or two, you want to make sure you have really clear numbers that you can give them. A confused mind will say no, and so you don't want to give them bad financials for any properties you have, for yourself. And I wrote another article. I can probably post it up here after the live stream is over, on how we get our loans approved. And one of the ways I usually have a Dropbox folder. I put every document I can think of. I try to separate them out. I have information on the properties, information on us, individual, and information on the company. I have our tax returns, our profit and loss statements, our rent rolls. Take pictures of the property. I try to make it very simple to navigate. In the front, I have in the first folder I have our business plan. I have our resumes. I have our and I kind of have a one document that just walks them through the process, like walks them through where everything is and what the big numbers are. And if you don't have a really complicated taxes, that makes that much easier. But it's not just to give them everything they need and give it to them clearly. That's incredibly important, because again, a confused mind says no. And if a bank doesn't know exactly, can't make heads or tails of what your position is, they're just going to say no. But it's also, you want to impress them. Like, this is how organized I am. This is how professional I am. You are trying to say multiple things here. Give them all the information they need, but also show how professional you are, and make sure they understand that you're taking this seriously. I mean, they're not just number crunchers. They're not just these nerds with just crunching numbers. Like, oh, it fits. No, but especially when it gets into investment properties and local banks, which are the best banks to go to for this type of investment. It's a lot of it's personal. A lot of it's, do they trust you? And so take them out to lunch, get to know them, Be friendly, build rapport. Be genuine too. People can see a fake a mile away, and try to be as professional as possible and give them as good of documents and as good accounting as possible. And if you need to hire an accountant to put it together, I think it's worth it. But that kind of getting your ducks in a row there and starting right now. I think even if you haven't bought a property, it's worth trying to look for possible contractors. It's worth looking for what attorney we use. Building your team is something that you can start doing while you're looking for properties or even before. It's not something to wait for. And so looking for banks up front before you need them, because if you wait till when you need them, you're going to be holding that property for much longer than you were originally planning. And that just means more holding costs. And we've had budgets blown solely because of holding costs. It is one of those expenses that people always tend to underestimate. Well, all expenses tend to be underestimated, but that's one of the worst that tends to be underestimated. And so don't wait. Start looking for a bank as soon as you want to get into real estate investment. Okay, so let's go through more questions here. Let's see. Tony Peters, what's considered a hard money lender? I don't know if there's an official definition for a hard money lender, but generally a hard money lender is somebody who's expensive. No, a hard money lender it's basically somebody who lends on real estate based on the property and generally before any rehab has been done or anything like that. So they're not looking so much at the borrower themselves. And it's generally a short-term loan. They're generally not looking to hold it very long. And it's generally, the average numbers you're looking at are about 3 to 5 points. That's 3 to 5% of the purchase price, or 3 to 5% of the loan that you're going to have to pay is just points, plus 12 to 15% interest. It's quite expensive, and that doesn't include other loan costs that might be associated with, like title fees and things like that. So it's quite expensive, but it's for those properties that it's generally used by flippers on properties that are not, that need a lot of work or something like that. That the person's not going to planning on holding for very long, and because nobody holds hard money loans for a long time. They are meant for short turnovers on those. But I don't know if there's an official definition, but it's basically expensive loans for short-term financing on properties that generally for flippers. I've seen it used for buy and hold, like for the BRRRR strategy, but I don't recommend. If possible, I'd recommend trying to find another strategy. They're good hard money lenders. We've used them before, but I would generally try to find another strategy because it's very expensive money, and if you can find that money cheaper, well, obviously you're going to do better. Okay, from Jose, in BRRRR, are we using the next down payment derived from the equity of the last property on the new refinanced mortgage loan? I believe blanks will want about 80% loan to value. Generally, I've seen about 75% loan to value. So the way there's a lot of different ways to do it. BRRRR is sort of a loose definition, but if let's say, it depends. If you don't get a loan up front on the property, and you refinance it out, so you pull out 75% of let's say you pull out all of all the money you put into it. Well, then you can use that money on the next property. You can use it on several other properties if you wanted to get those financed up front. If you are simply, but let's say you get a private loan on the property, and you get, and then you fix up the property, you rent it out, you refinance it, you did it right, 75% all in, the bank basically just pays off the private loan. That down payment, that equity you have in the property is just the down payment on the equity that you have in the first property acts as the down payment in that property itself. You don't pull any money out. Now, maybe if you do really well and you get, you're all in for 50%, you pull out some money. But generally, I see it as you are trying to simply refinance this property and for free, and so you have the property for free without having any of your own money into it. If you do really well, you can pull out some extra money to use on the next one, but or if you don't have a loan up front, you can get your money back, all of your money if you do it right, and use that money on the next one. But if you have private lenders like we do it, it's sort of the way Jose is referring to it. We ask that private lender, do you want to lend on the next property? and usually they do. Usually they want their money working for them, so we just put them onto the next property and we go from there. From Brett, do you have a minimum cash flow amount for the properties you target? Do you take appreciation into account? We do not take appreciation into account. Well, we sort of do. We split it into three different areas. We have cash flow properties, equity or value properties, and equity properties. And equity properties, I mean, this is not like an A property. We're not looking for luxury housing. That's not what we do. But these would be properties in nicer areas. If you know Kansas City at all, like kind of downtown Lee Summit, that would be one area that works for us in this area. It's gotten, at least it used to, it's gotten quite expensive. Cash flow ones, we're not looking for war zones, but they're ones that are in lower end areas, a little bit more transient, a little bit more vacancy, but higher, a higher rent to cost. So I despise the 2% rule, but something closer to that, like in this market, maybe a 1.5% rent to cost. So we are looking. So in all those depending on which one of those types of areas are. That kind of depends on what our cash flow requirement is. We need a higher amount of cash flow if we're in a worse area than if we're in a really good area. If we're in a really good area, we don't need that much cash flow because we know this area has a higher appreciation potential. It'll be easier to sell if we ever do. It'll be easier to refinance. We're gonna have less hassles with it, etc. Usually, I set it. I want at least $100 per unit per year. If it's in a lower end area, I generally want to be closer to $200. Now that is with fairly, all this depends on the assumptions you use. So I'll try to pencil it out and go through. I expect to put in the taxes, the insurance, what I expect the maintenance to be, what I expect the recurring capital expenses to be. But that it's heavily based on assumptions. It's heavily based, and with houses, it could be up and down. It could be all over the place. You have one bad turnover, and that can make your numbers look horrible. Whereas if you have a tenant who stays there for 6 years and doesn't complain at all, you're just going to cash flow. You just basically have a mint that prints money for you. I also look at the rent to cost. So I'm a little bit more cautious with cash flow per unit and cap rates with regards to houses or duplexes or things like that. Those are better for apartments and larger properties. But I do look at that, trying to make sure it's the case, and I also look backwards at it. You want to look backwards at how well have your properties done. Are they meeting the expectations you had up front? A prediction is no good if you're not actually checking it to see how accurate you are and making adjustments moving forward. But I also look for rent to cost amounts, and I think the 2% rule, which basically says you should buy properties for 2%, that rent for 2% of their all-in cost. So I think it's a terrible rule because it's too vague. It's going to push people towards the worst areas where that you'll get that, but only on paper, and then in real life you just end up losing money. It's too broad. But depending on the area, we set these rent to cost targets. That so we have if we're in a rough area, we want to be at least 1.5%. If we're in a really good area or a good area, we want to be 1%. If you're in a much more expensive market, it might be 0.8% or something like that. So we've kind of based those percentages on what we think it will probably cash flow at. But my minimum is generally fully financed $100 a month with fairly conservative assumptions. And again, whenever you're comping a property, whenever you're looking at any of these sorts of estimates and performas and things like that, it's as much art as it is science. And that's why one of the reasons it's good to have contingencies and it's good to have wiggle room. Because if you're wrong, you don't want to be riding the line. You don't want to be where I have to be right or this property doesn't work. You want to have some wiggle room in case you are wrong. Well, okay, it still works. It's just not as well as I thought. And if you're wrong in the other direction, which we've been too, then it really, really works. Okay, so let's look at another question here. Karen, from Karen Moore. How do you find handymen? I find it's the hardest position to find. I agree with you, Karen. Handymen can be very difficult to find. The best way, one is just to really start looking through all the sources you can. And the first one, again, is the same as banks and same with property management companies. And that's go to your local RIA group and start asking people if they have contractors they know that they've used. And if they've done well for other investors, they're more likely to do well for you. That being said, it's a little harder to wring contractors out of investors, because if they're working for you, they can't be working for them. We've used Craigslist and Angie's List. We've used Indeed. We've looked through all these guys. But I'd say, call them. When or either they'll call you or you call them. Ask them some questions. Ask them, what kind of, how quickly can they get started? Are they insured? Do they have different states are different? Do they have a license? They might need a license in certain states. Ask them all those questions. Ask them, and if it sounds like it's something that makes sense, ask them for references. I once called one of our contractors' references that he gave me, and we talked the next day, and he said, it's not a bad thing, but that was the first time somebody had called any of my references in like 7 years. And it's like, references, even if they're provided by the contractor, they'll still tell you things. I've had references provided by this one was by a property management company, which basically said their books were completely shot. And so they'll tell you things. And so I would highly recommend talking to their asking for their references. I'd also recommend trying to put together as detailed a scope of work as possible. I would not rely on contractors to put together their own scope of work, and I would certainly not want something vague like we'll fix kitchen, which includes cabinets and countertops and whatever. I've seen these before where they bulk it all together. And I don't like it at all for several reasons. The first one is this is very likely going to lead to a conflict at the end. You're like, well, I told you to do this. And like, well, I don't remember that. I mean, it's not in it's not in this blob of a bid I sent you. And that's just, you want to avoid as many problems like that as you can up front. Secondly, when you look at the line items individualized, you can see it helps you see, like if you just have it broken out, you want a line item bid. You don't want them to give a bulk bid. Because sometimes it might look, well, that's not that bad. When you look at items, it's like, okay, it's $450 to replace a toilet. Okay, no, that's not going to work. You get an idea of, or if there's one particular item you're not so sure about and they bid it really high, you can just cross it off the list. But the most important thing is that this makes it much more likely that they're going to go through and get all those items done. And also, it's sort of a vetting technique. Like, they're not going to miss things. They're not going to miss little things and have arguments about it. But it's sort of a vetting technique. If they can go through that whole bid and give you items, these little lazy. We've had a lot of people will give them a bid and they just don't come back to us. And so, if they go through that whole thing, it's more likely that they're actually diligent and professional and will do well. And I guess in that same token, don't settle for one bid. Especially up front if you don't have a contractor that you like. Get a couple. Don't be afraid to tell people no. I mean, it's part of the business. It's something you have to get used to. It's hard up front, but it gets easier. And trust me, they've heard it plenty before. And if a contractor's not getting the job done, I'd recommend kind of putting in, maybe putting a contract together. Maybe we've thought about putting in like incentives, like if you can finish in a certain time, we give you a little bonus if it takes over extra time, costs you off the contract. Also, don't pay the last bill. Don't pay it all up front for sure, but don't pay the last bill until everything's done and you're completely happy, because it's very hard to get them to come back. And if they're really just not getting the job done, don't be afraid. Just be like, I'm sorry, you're off the job, or put pressure on them. Somebody's got to put pressure on them, and also just realize that you're gonna have some bad ones. You're gonna have to sort through that, and that's just another. It's kind of one of those things you need to prepare for in your contingency, that you might have a bad contractor. But we found good contractors all over the place. We've used 1099, and we've also used people on staff. But the best place to look is, best and first place to look is asking people at your local RIA, and then checking out. Indeed is good. Craigslist, you might find Craigslist can be good, but you might also find some lower quality. Angie's List, you'll probably find higher quality, but they'll be more expensive. And then there's and then also. I make it sound like you can only ask for referrals at these various RIAs. There's no reason to settle for only there. Referrals are the best source for pretty much any contact, and they also can be very good sources for leads. And so, if you know anyone who's been using contractors or people in construction or whatever, ask them, or you just bring. One of the things, a good piece of advice I heard a while back, is make sure that you're not hiding the fact you're in real estate. Tell people what you're doing. Tell people, don't be like annoying about it. But tell them, I'm buying real estate. We're looking to do some rehab and whatnot, and And maybe people are like, I had this great contractor, 6 months ago rebuilt my deck. Like, oh yeah, please give me their number. And this, so there's just always be talking to people, always be asking for referrals, and always remember that if they've done right by somebody else, particularly another investor, they're much more likely to have done right by you. It's not the only way to find them, but that is the best way to find them in my particular opinion. Let's see, here we go. This is from Anonymous. Long question. Why would you refinance if you're planning to hold after rehab? From what I understand, your property is reappraised at a higher value, thus higher monthly. I think you're thinking, yes, the main point, and there are multiple strategies with regards to real estate investment. And one of them is particularly conservative. I think the Millionaire Real Estate Investor. Gary Keller talks some stories about different investors who had a lot of success, and one of those is this husband and wife team who would buy a house and put all their extra income into paying down the mortgage till it was nothing, and then they buy another one. They always get them financed, and then they put all the extra income they had to getting it paid down to nothing. And so they didn't want to have debt, and they ended up having like 25 or 30 houses or something like that. Very conservative strategy, but they're millionaires, and it's like it works. Or you could be like more like my father, who's a bit of a gunslinger when it comes to real estate investment, and likes to always, likes to buy, as much as he can, because OPM, other people's money, the leverage factor of real estate is one of its most important advantages. If you're willing to stomach that risk, there is risk with it. Debt always comes with risk. So the reason to get a loan on the back end is basically, yes, it will be appraised at a higher price. You will be paying more on the mortgage. But at the same time, that means you have less of your own money in the property. And so even if you're only getting $200 in cash flow instead of $400 in cash flow every month, if you have $200 in cash flow but you only have $5,000 into the house, that's sorry. If you have $200 in cash flow but only $500 in the house, yes, $5,000 in the house. You have a much higher cash-on-cash return than if you're making $400 a month, but you have $25,000 into the house, because you're looking at your cash-on-cash return, and the higher cash-on-cash return is, and the less money of your own that you use to purchase these properties, that gives you the ability to buy more, and that gives you the ability to increase your net worth substantially faster. That being said, you increase it faster with more risk. So it's a trade-off. It's one of those things that real estate, any investment, or pretty much anything in life has. There's always going to be a trade-off between risk and reward. And using debt means more risk, but more reward. And one of the things I really like about the BRRRR strategy is when done right, you have a 25% margin in these properties, or thereabout. And that margin is not your own money, but still, if the market tanks and goes down 20%, you still have less in the property than it's worth. You can still sell the property and pay off the mortgage, even if the market tanks 20%. So you have built-in cushion that protects you from market corrections, even though you're using debt. That being said, you still have debt, so there's still more risk if you do it that way. Let's scroll down here a little bit more. Let's see. Got any more questions? I think that's about it. I think we've gone over quite a lot of stuff. If there's I would say a couple of quick tips before we leave here. With regards to rehab, one of the most important things is to really make the front of the house look nice. Don't leave anything missing there. That is the first impression both tenants and the bank will get, and the appraiser. And first impressions, we're not machines, we're not computers. First impressions mean a lot. So make sure the front of the house looks nice, cleaned, well kept. You want to put a little bit extra money in there, make sure to do that. Let's see. With regards to renting, finding tenants, screen like your life depends on it. The worst thing you can have it's better to have a vacant property than a property with a bad tenant. Evictions and turnovers, particularly when a tenant trashes a place, and all the costs you have of having both a vacancy as well as a tenant who's not paying the eviction cost, the cost of repairs, it's not worth it. make sure to screen very well. We don't accept evictions unless they're extremely old. Same with felonies. And you want to make sure the tenant has, generally speaking, depending on the market, about 3 times the income of the rent, and has good employment and history, good employment history, and good rental history. The tenant will generally reflect the quality of the property. The quality of the tenant will reflect the quality of the property. So if you're going to be a slumlord, you should expect the type of tenants that you're going to get are going to be that type. Make sure you're not yet with buy and hold. You're not looking to make it great. You're looking to make it very nice, functional, something that you'd be willing, maybe not what you want to live in, but something you'd be willing to live in. Let's see here. Anything else really worth noting? Yeah, I mean, I guess I just sum it up. Let me go through any last questions that any of y'all have. I think we've pretty much summed it up here. All right. Yeah, again, I think of BRRRR as flipping a property to yourself. You are trying to, instead of using that equity in that property to make a profit off of, you're using that as the down payment to hold that, to keep that, to basically rebuy that property, but now without any of your own money in it. And I thank you all for joining me. It's been a great stream, and I wish you the best of luck. Ask any other questions you have in the comments section, and I will make sure to try to answer them as best I can. Have a great day, and have a great weekend as well.